Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Debaters Council's motion debriefs, the motions that were set at recent tournaments. My name is Thithira Jayakody. I am currently the debating coach at Ladies College. Today we'll be talking about the motion that was recently set at the Lilion Nixon Debating Championship 2024 at the semifinals. Under the theme of morality and ethics, the motion reads, this House believes that there is no inherent moral obligation to follow the law. I repeat, this House believes that there is no inherent moral obligation to follow the law. We'll start with discussing proposition first. I think the way you almost want to frame the motion on proposition is to suggest that laws are imposed by the state as a restriction of people's autonomy and choice. And sometimes this might lead to good things. But for every single law that bans murder, there are also laws that legalize slavery in the past. There are also laws that ban homosexuality even to the current date. So opposition can't cherry pick good laws. They need to prove why the whole body of law inherently demands that you obey it as a result of it being the law, and that alone should be the moral justification as to why there is a moral obligation to follow the law. So I think in terms of setup, you want to establish three different things. The first thing you want to establish is what the law really is. I think you can say that the law is codified and imposed by the state, often with consequences, severe consequences attached when people do not follow the law. And I think here you want to establish that this is also why the debate, it cannot be one about the practical, because people will follow the law most of the time anyway, because they want to avoid punishment like being sent to jail. I think similarly, whether or not people think that the law is moral is unaffected by the motion. The motion is not, this House believes that or prefers a world in which people think that the law is moral, but rather about whether we as like six rational individuals believe that the law creates an inherent moral obligation for it to be followed in the first place. So I think both sides would benefit from straying away from arguments about what happens practically if people do not follow the law or if people do not believe that the law is moral, given that if the other side disagrees with you, they can probably dismiss your entire argument in a sentence or two. The second thing I think I'd establish on setup is there can be individual laws that are just because they uphold and enforce inherently moral things. So not murdering people, for example, might be inherently moral. So a law upholding that by banning murder might be moral as a result of upholding a good thing. But you want to establish that this is separate from the law being moral because it is a law. That specific law we think is only moral just and justified because it upholds something that we consider moral for other reasons, um, independent of whether or not it is a law in the first place. So this is the way that you can outframe the instances in which you might agree that the law is good and moral as well. The third and final thing I think is just like burden push and bring in examples that are good for your side. So you want to say that this debate spans time and geography. So it's not just about Sri Lankan law or law right now in the world. It's also US laws in the 1800s legalizing slavery. It's Nazi German laws that required you to betray a spouse who expresses discontent with the Nazi regime. All of those examples and other examples of bad and unjust laws entirely within the debate and should be debated by opposition as well. So they can't just cherry pick the laws that are good, like the ones against murder, and make the debate about that. In terms of argumentation, I think I see a case split with two arguments of opposition. The first, I think, is why the formation and creation of laws is itself unjust, which is why all laws do not inherently create a moral compulsion to obey. I think the second argument you make is that the law enforces unjust obligations and behaviors sometimes, which is why it, even if most laws are moral, why the existence of some unjust laws takes away the inherent obligation to follow the body of the law as a concept. In terms of the first argument, I think you want to almost establish and prove three different things inside the argument. I think the first thing you want to establish is why the creation of the law has no guarantee of morality in every possible kind of state and every possible kind of legal system. I think I can go beyond that and actually prove why it is guaranteed that it will be immoral instead. The second thing you want to prove is why the social contract is illegitimate and why people cannot consent to the law being imposed upon them, especially laws that are immoral in their nature. The third and final thing you want to prove is why the right to free choice and why individual autonomy matters more and should be prioritized in this debate in terms of determining whether this is moral or not in the first place. So I think on to the first burden of the argument, there are a range of possible states and types of states. So I think this ranges from like autocratic to fully democratic. Obviously, in autocracies, this is relatively easy for you to prove. The law is just what one person or a group of people think is good. And often this is what is good for them as opposed to good for the majority of people, which then means that there's like literally no moral guarantee that the law is actually good or what most people want in the first place. I think the same mechanistic logic applies to like partially good democracies. So like countries like Sri Lanka or India, which perhaps not India, like maybe countries like Sri Lanka or Indonesia, where there might be some like inequalities in free and fair elections, where there might be electoral rigging, corruption involved in politics. In those countries as well, maybe some people have their voices heard, but a lot of others do not. And at that point, we have no guarantee that the law will be a moral and accurate representation of what most people want in the first place. But I do think even in full democracies, you can establish that the creation of the law is likely to be unjust and immoral. This is because just because we aggregate the preferences of a lot of different people doesn't actually mean that we create something moral in the first place. And the way that you prove this is by establishing that people are in and of themselves immoral, because we are selfish, we are biased towards our own communities, we often preference ourselves over other people, we have an empathetic gap with people that we don't relate to, for example, which means that, and our lack of rationality in comparison to all of these emotional impulses means that we don't make morally correct decisions most of the time. And so if we believe that an individual human being is not always moral, if anything, more immoral than probably moral, it's unclear why aggregating a bunch of immoral opinions creates a moral good in and of itself. So just because a society is democratic does not mean that the laws that it creates are like actually moral and morally legitimate in the first place. So the intuition pump I think you can use to establish this is that even if everyone in society unanimously agreed one day that rape was a moral thing, this probably does not mean that rape actually starts being a moral thing in the first place. And then you transition into proving why this is harmful and why this is not justified by the existence of a social contract. You say that people's rights and choices are stripped away by a state under the threat of actual real violence and consequences to make them abide by the restrictions that you have already proven are morally unjust. You then establish that people are not means to an end and should never be instrumentalized, especially in the service of unjust goals and unjust restrictions imposed upon you by the state. I think you want to establish also a counterfactual, which is that, or at least guard against the response that opposition will give to your counterfactual, which is that even if people inherently individually might not make more moral choices than the law, it doesn't matter, because what you say morally matters is that the removal of state coercion is principally good in and of itself, because like if people are immoral themselves, the law is an aggregation of people's preferences on their best case, which means that like the morality is symmetric. What is not symmetric is that they have state coercion, you do not, and that is a moral benefit. Lastly, in terms of how you guard against the argument about the social contract, I think you want to just deny that the social contract legitimizes the imposition of laws, because the choice and like voluntary engagement part of this contract is like a choice in the thinnest sense of the word. Our consumption of state resources when we're under 18, for example, which is often used as a justification of our consent into the state's restrictions, is often non-consensual. Like no 3-year-old is like rationally evaluating whether they want to be part of the state or not. And even when you reach the age of majority, what capacity is there to like really leave the state in the first place? Like every other option that you could leave to is also presumably a state with a monopoly of violence, at least nominally, if not effectively. And you have to leave behind everything and everyone you have ever known in your entire lifetime. Like, is this at all a free choice is something you can really question. But even if like the contract is also not something that people ever sign, actually, it is just a thought experiment that we use to assume that people would consent to the power of the state given the benefits they receive. So even if you concede that the choice might be actually legitimate, it is not an actual choice people are still making. It is an assumption of what their choices might look like. And you can say that the assumption of our choices is a moral harm in and of itself, given the like relative weight of the stakes involved, which is that these are really morally important considerations about whether or not laws should exist, because these laws are a monopoly of violence that the state is exerting against us, throwing us in jail, taking away our autonomy, taking away our money through fines and things like that. All of that is really serious considerations. And the mere existence of a law is such an oppressive reality that we should not assume people's choices, even if the thought experiment works, which you can also establish that it really doesn't. So I think the conclusion to the first argument is that structurally, it is more likely than not that most laws are immoral because most people are immoral in and of themselves. A lot of governing systems are imperfect in and of themselves. What this means is that you are using immoral laws to restrict people's choices and behaviors with real consequences attached. This is unjust. A social contract does not justify all of this. I think the second argument to establish and prove is why the existence of some unjust laws takes away from the obligation to follow the entire body of the law as well. Three things to prove again in the argument. The first is why laws are structurally likely to discriminate against certain groups of people. Second, about why this leads to tyranny by the majority. And connected to this, I think, is the third and final, almost impacting level about why this makes the law unjust. I think the establishment of why laws are structurally likely to discriminate can be analyzed in a lot more significant detail than I will establish now. But I think the way you can go about this, or rather the direction with which you want to approach it perhaps, is that people again have strong incentives to be tribalistic, to form an in-group that they belong to and an out-group that they can alienate and form a common group against. Like you create a common enemy that enforces your social bonds better. People are selfish and experience an empathy gap between people that they do not relate to, which means that you are more likely to discriminate against numerically smaller groups of people, like ethnic minorities, like sexual minorities, or women, for example. In democracies, what this leads to is majoritarian law becomes popular, i.e., US miscegenation laws, which prevented black and white people from marrying each other up until the 1960s, because a majority of racist white people in America thought that this was something good, regardless of what the minority of people who wanted to be in these relationships thought themselves. In autocracies, what this translates into is those governments often alienating and scapegoating those minorities to keep the majority group happy, which then suggests that across the range of governments, again, some groups of people, as a result of being socially vulnerable, are more likely to be targeted by the law. So I think what you establish after this is that the system of law is very likely to be bent towards the service of the majority and becomes an instrument of majoritarian tyranny, as opposed to following a system of law or morality, rather, that we think is good in the first place. And here I think you want to rhetorically really push what the unfairness and injustice of the system is likely going to look like. Like, why should a slave be considered immoral if they run away from their owner? Why are black South Africans immoral for violently protesting against apartheid? Why are gay people immoral for being in a relationship with who they want to be with, while not harming anyone else? Like, all of these are questions you should be forcing opposition to answer across the debate. You should be analyzing why this is so deeply damaging, bringing in examples of where all of these things were laws at certain points in history. And I think the last thing you establish after this is why this matters morally, is that you say that not only are people being instrumentalized, like we prove in the first argument, this often happens in ways that are intersectional with the most marginalized and vulnerable groups of people. They're instrumentalized a lot more, they're harmed a lot more, and this is something that is particularly unjust, given that we think states and societies in general should have more obligations towards these people than everyone else. So the mere existence of some of these really discriminatory, damaging laws is such a blight on the moral character of the body of the law that even if these bad laws are a minority of laws, they are more than good enough to stop a general obligation to follow the law as a concept from existing. And you want to tie this back to the burden that you're pushing onto opposition. Opposition needs to prove a general obligation to all laws. And you say that the mere existence of some bad laws alone is more than good enough to take away from that kind of general obligation, given that the character of the body of the law is generally not established and in suspect after you establish that really bad laws like this exist. So I think that's broadly the conclusion to the proposition case. Again, this is not meant to be comprehensive. I imagine there are other ideas and perhaps better ideas as well, but this is how I would approach the proposition case. In terms of the opposition case, I think what you want to establish in terms of framing is that every single law might not be just, but the existence of enforceable codes of conduct leads to more beneficial outcomes than harmful ones, which then creates an obligation to follow the law, instead of, on proposition's world, leaving it up to individual people to decide what is moral or what is immoral. And then you establish why the law is more beneficial than harmful later on in your case, obviously. But in terms of setup, I think opposition setup matters somewhat significantly more than propositions, because you need to breathe a lot of room into where your case can be viable within the motion. So I think what this translates into is like four things in setup. The first thing is you almost want to like define the law. If proposition does this, you can skip this obviously, which is that the law is a series of rules agreed upon in society that are instituted with consequence and to the purpose of establishing and maintaining social order. More likely than not, you'll probably have to prove this in the argument. You also establish and agree with proposition that people will follow the law anyway. This is not a debate about the practical. The second thing you can say is that define where moral obligations come from. I think you can say they come from multiple different sources. Some obligations come from inalienable rights, such as the right to be free from torture, for example, and the existence of such inalienable rights creates a moral obligation to uphold those in the first place. But you can also say that some moral obligations come from a place of utility. So if we followed the moral obligation, if we would create a society that is utilitarianly better than a world in which the obligation did not exist, that might translate into an obligation to uphold that as well. So the freedom of expression that most governments are obliged to uphold isn't stemming from a fundamental inalienable right, but rather exists because we acknowledge that this will be more beneficial than not to have, because it allows you to critique the government, for example, and achieves a bunch of good things, which is why governments are obliged and expected to uphold this in the first place. The third thing you want to establish is that to frame your burden quite specifically, your burden is to prove that there is an inherent obligation to follow the law, which is to say that the law should be followed on the basis that it is the law. This does not, however, mean that this inherent obligation needs to be fundamental and overriding at all times. Like, for example, we inherently think that children should have an obligation to their parents as a result of their parents doing good things for them. But we do not obviously uphold that obligation when it comes to like really abusive families, for example. So just because an inherent obligation exists does not mean that it is overriding. So the fourth thing you establish is that following from this, we don't need to prove that every single piece of law in the history of humanity ever is always just, but rather that the body of the law that should be followed and individual extreme cases of unfairness are out of the debate. And what matters is that the body of the law is more just than unjust. So that's the way you frame out the worst examples, or at least you attempt to. I imagine this will become the subject of a lot more discussion down the debate. In terms of arguments, first, I think is about protecting social order and why this translates into an obligation. The second, I think, following along from the same lines, is why the law better enables social progress and why that's a good thing in and of itself. In terms of the first argument about protecting social order, I think three things to establish here. The first is that the law is helpful in preserving social order. Second is that people benefit from the preservation of social order. Third is that the creation of utility is a moral justification as to why people should follow the law. And I think that part is probably the most contentious in the debate as well. But I imagine the first version of the burden in the argument might also be slightly contentious. So that's where I'd focus most of my effort and energy on. In terms of whether the law actually protects social order, you want to first establish the counterfactual about people being selfish and people being prioritizing their own gain over general social good. Talk about the state of nature, where people like life is nasty, brutish, and short because people continually create violence and the worst harms against each other to try and benefit themselves. Talk about the tragedy of the commons. I think this analysis is relatively easy to establish. What is slightly more difficult, I think, is to establish the comparative, which is that governments have better incentives in the creation of the law. I think what you can say is that democratic states aggregate people's preferences, which means that it is likely that everyone is protected by the law, perhaps not like perfectly equally, but it is more likely than not that everyone has some protections, which is often what you see in constitutions with fundamental rights like the right to life that are afforded to everyone. Even in autocratic states, governments often want to keep people relatively happy in order to solidify their control, because an autocratic state in anarchy has no control over their country and is more likely to be overturned in the first place, which is why they're likely to uphold like things like public safety, which is why they're likely to try to keep their citizens relatively happy, which then suggests that social order is upheld even in these countries as well, even if there are, again, some exceptions to like justice and whether or not like autocratic states do some bad things. So you establish that, generally speaking, the law is what prevents society from descending into anarchy and what establishes a social order that people benefit from. And that's what you establish in the second level of the argument, which is that everyone benefits from social order and that this translates into a moral obligation, which you prove later on. So establishing that people benefit from the social order, I think, is relatively easy. Everyone partakes in this benefit, they benefit from it, which is why we think this translates to somewhat of an obligation on their end as well. The social contract on opposition, I think the analysis is that it hypothetically suggests that people would consent given the circumstances that they would be in otherwise. And therefore, it does not matter if there is some degree of coercion involved in whether people opt to be part of the state or not. And I think there are reasons you can give as to why perfect consent doesn't matter. One, you can question whether perfect consent exists in the first place, given that we never really have perfect information about literally anything. But the second thing you can establish is that even if like the idea of perfect consent were plausible, a lot of moral obligations don't stem from places of perfect consent. Like the obligation to your family, for example, none of us chose the families we were born into. That doesn't mean that those obligations do not exist. So you refute the premise that consent is the only base through which moral obligations can be built. So you establish that utility exists. You establish that the social contract justifies the imposition of law because people benefit equally from the existence of the law as much as their right to choice is constrained as well. I think the last and most contentious part of the argument is establishing why utility is still a justification as to why you have an inherent obligation to follow the law. And I think the analysis for this is that the utility of the law existing only exists as a result of the law being the law. And I think what I mean by this is that there's a law saying that murder is bad, but if laws did not exist and like there was a social belief that murder was bad, obviously there would be significantly more murders than in a society where there was a law that was enforced by the government that prevented people from committing murder. So the mere existence of a rule or a social belief saying that murder is bad does not lead to the same utilitarian outcomes that a law to the same effect would have, which is that a law saying that murder is bad is always practically more effective than a social norm or belief saying that murder is bad. So the utilitarian benefit is inherent to the nature of the law as something that is universal and enforced by governments and societies. So that's why the utilitarian benefit is inherent to the nature of the law, which is why the utilitarian justification is also a reason as to why you should inherently follow the law. And I think you want to establish why utilitarianism works as a moral justification as well. And the way you do this is by establishing that utility is the least arbitrary of moral metrics as well, which is it's an assumption that everyone's life matters equally, that everyone's happiness matters equally, which is why creating as much good for the largest number of people is a justification in and of itself. The last piece of gatekeeping analysis that you almost want to do is to guard against the proposition response of, yeah, obviously people are going to follow the law on either side of the house. The counterfactual is a disingenuous one. You want to agree, like you're not saying that people will stop following the law on propositions world. You want to be incredibly clear that won't happen. But discussing whether a world without the law is worse than a world in which the law exists matters a lot morally, because when we're deciding whether something is good or not, we need to evaluate whether it is more beneficial than not, because if it is, that might be a moral good in and of itself to exist in society as well. So I think you want to establish that you're not saying that this would happen on their side. You're just saying that given the counterfactual in the absence of law is worse than a world in which we have the law, this is a moral obligation to follow the law as per all the analysis you've given so far. In terms of the second argument, I didn't think this is somewhat shorter. You establish why the law enables social progression better on your side. And I think this is to guard against a possible version of the proposition argument that the law actually prevents social progress and liberalization, because there are certain laws that are very difficult to overcome or overturn. And this is part of their argument that this constrains individual liberty. I think what you want to prove here is that social progress can happen even with the existence of some unjust laws. People can protest within the remit of the law. Like many states constitutionally enshrine the right to protest and freedom of speech. Even if, unfortunately, some people break the law, this sometimes manifests as a criticism of unjust laws, i.e. civil disobedience, i.e. violent protests against like inequality and unfairness. You want to concede that like the existence of laws that are unjust might make social progress slightly difficult, but this is not the point. Because there are reasons why social progress will happen either way. Some mechanisms for this, I think, could include the globalization of media and information means that people are more aware of what they can and should receive from their governments. They demand more freedoms, they demand more liberalization. Second, you can establish that the sustainability of extractive political institutions that economically and socially disenfranchise vast swaths of the population, like the working class, for example, are incredibly unsustainable due to pure demographic pressure, which is why you saw things like the overthrow of feudalism, which is why you see increasing labor protections for the working class across the world. And the third and final thing maybe is just you can empirically establish that the world has been shifting more towards democratization rather than away from it in the past 30 or 50 years, something along those lines. Again, more mechanisms can exist. You should probably try to prove this better than I do. But once you establish this, I think you want to establish that given that social change happens anyway, the quality of social change on your side is better. And the way you do this is that once social change on your side is implemented, it becomes a non-negotiable, enforceable rule for the entire population. So the social change is universally implemented. So when society agrees that discriminating against gay people is bad, for example, a law is created in your world, which means that individuals cannot decide whether they want to discriminate against gay people because the law tells them and that they cannot do so, which is why the vast majority of society is likely to change. The comparative on proposition is obviously individual people can decide what is moral or not, and individual homophobes might continue discriminating against gay people, even if the law prevents this from occurring, which means that the amount of change required to have a significant social impact in proposition's world is significantly higher than in your world, because in your world, you just need to convince the government to change some laws, whereas they need to convince literally everyone in society, a much higher, if not impossible, bar to prove. Again, I think you want to rely on the analysis from earlier, which is that you're not saying that this will happen in their world, but that the mere thought experiment suggesting that you have more utility in your world is the reason as to why the law might be moral in the first place. So I think this is a strong way to defang the argument about social progress being slower in your world by establishing that once you achieve the social progress, at least there is no backsliding, at least there is no inconsistency, and that this is a good thing. Okay, that's about it for both sides. Hopefully this helped. Thank you.